Well, welcome everybody to Rise in Five Steps to Change Your Practice. My name is Dr. Matthew Rivera. I'm an assistant professor at Indiana State University in the Doctorate in Athletic Training program. And today I want to talk to you guys about five simple steps that you guys can take to start implementing change into your clinical practice or just in life in general. And so what I want to do is kind of give you guys 5 steps, but also within those 5 steps, kind of break those down into some actionable and tangible items that you guys can implement starting today. So I think the first thing that I want to talk about when we start talking about change, I think the first thing we always go to is the idea of barriers to change. And so when we look specifically within athletic training, we see a lot of literature that looks at barriers to change specifically within either certain tasks or documentation, the use of patient-reported outcomes. But globally, when we look at change, and as I was thinking about this, there were 4 main barriers that I wanted to address before we get going on actual steps so that we can see how each of these steps will address these barriers. The first one is a lack of perceived control or involvement. And so what I typically refer to this as a sense of ownership. So maybe in your current clinical practice, you feel that you don't have a lot of say in what goes on, or there might be, you might be in a temporary role such as a graduate assistantship or something similar to that, where you feel that your influence is not that high, or that you may not be taken as serious, or the ideas that you are presenting may not resonate with whoever your supervisor might be. And so that could be one barrier to change that we think about, this lack of perceived control or involvement within process change. The other one related to organization, it could be the organizational complexity. So if you don't know how to create change within your clinical practice or within your organization, so maybe there's a multi-level hierarchy that you're not sure, you know who your direct supervisor is, but you're not sure who is above them, or what that process might look like to create change. That could also pose a challenge to change in your clinical practice. I think the couple that we always get and that we know quite often is time and resources. So we have this perceived lack of time to implement change in our practice, and we have so many things that we're already doing. So we tend to avoid change, or we tend to just stick to the way we've always done it because we don't think that we have enough time or resources to actually change the way that we're practicing, or elevate or advance the way that we're practicing. So that third one being time and resources. And then the last one, which I think actually could be the most detrimental or the most dangerous to us, and has actually been the most dangerous to us as athletic trainers, is what I'm going to call a fixed mindset. So this idea that this is the way we've always done it, or this is the way that my preceptor taught me to do it, so that's the way that I'm going to do it. Or the idea of, I think we've all heard this before, if it's not broken, why fix it? And I think that when we think about medicine and healthcare that's constantly evolving and constantly changing, if we stick to the way that we've always done it, the way that we're doing that and the evidence that we're using quickly becomes outdated. And if we're not continually changing or continually advancing and elevating our practice, we're going to become clinicians who are not utilizing the best evidence or providing the highest quality care that we can. So how do we overcome these barriers and challenges? So these 5 steps that you know, from the title and that I want to talk about, the first one is an awareness. So increasing our awareness, and the kind of 2 steps that I want to give you in here, the first one being increasing your self-awareness. So this is something that can be difficult if we have not done before, but is actually the foundational kind of groundwork that we need to lay in order to cause change either in our clinical practice or in our personal lives for that matter. So self-awareness is just the idea that you are becoming more aware of yourself and your surroundings. And so how do we do that? The first kind of actionable step would be meditation. And so this is something that we talk about within the DAT program quite a bit, being guided meditation or just meditation in general, to help kind of just hit the pause button throughout the day, either early in the morning, late at night, throughout your day, setting time specifically aside for some sort of guided meditation or an opportunity to just pause the day and just breathe. Just think about how your day has been going. Think about what things have been going well, what things have not been going well, and just maybe using some sort of app. There's great apps, particularly Headspace, that have free guided meditation that you can do anywhere from 30 seconds up to an hour. I would suggest starting with something smaller like 30 seconds or a minute if you haven't done this before. But what you do is you basically just take a second, get into a quiet area where you can be alone with your thoughts, and you just meditate. This is going to help you become more aware of yourself and of your surroundings and how your day has been going. The other step for self-awareness is reflection. And this could look differently for different people, but it's a crucial part in becoming more self-aware, but also in clinical practice, being able to reflect on decision-making, being able to reflect on why we make the decisions we do, reflecting on our day and how our work day went and how our personal life is going. This could look differently, like I mentioned, from journaling, which is something that I tend to do at night, where I journal how my day has gone, some successes, some failures, what I want to improve upon on the next day. It could just be spending some dedicated time just in reflection for your day. And what this does is it builds what's called metacognition. So you're thinking about your actual thinking, and that's going to help improve that self-awareness. So once we increase our self-awareness, what that does is it gives us an ability to recognize opportunities for change. So we start to become more aware of our surroundings, and we start to become more aware of the areas in which we could change and the areas in which we can improve or advance our clinical practice. And so this might look like after you've practiced some self-awareness, going into your clinical practice and noticing some processes or some decision-making that you're going through that could be improved upon. And typically we'll start to see this from big picture items, so things that we want to kind of completely overhaul. But what I suggest is looking for small opportunities, small things that you can change daily. And we're going to talk about how the actual process of incremental change in a second here. But by increasing our self-awareness, we can start to become more aware, and we start recognizing these opportunities for change. So once we've become more aware, that leads into our second step, which is empowerment. And what I want to say here is that regardless of your current clinical practice setting and your current position, what your job title might be, every single one of us has some level of authority, regardless of what that position title might be, what that managerial structure, what that hierarchy organizational structure might look like. We all have authority and we all have influence at some level. What we need to do is become more empowered to leverage that authority and influence that we have to not only empower ourselves, but also empower those around us. So as you are practicing your self-awareness and as you're starting to recognize these opportunities, start to consider where your authority and where your influence lies in what connections you already have with those that maybe have more authority in your organization, so that you can leverage those relationships and not only empower yourself, but you're also going to empower those around you to start creating change. So the idea for steps 1 and 2 basically is a self-awareness and then a self-empowerment, noticing and realizing and believing that you actually do have the power to change. And this is probably where I would say close to 50% of people who want to actually create change in their practice actually get stuck, because like I mentioned, that first barrier to change is this idea of a lack or lower perceived influence or control over change. But what we don't give enough recognition or weight to is the idea that regardless of our position or our title, we all have this level of authority that we have in our daily practice and our daily decision making to change, that we have some level of ability to advance our practice from a day-to-day basis. So after we've become aware and we've become empowered, then we need to actually go into planning. And this is probably one of the steps that if you guys have been kind of following the publicity of this webinar, you thought this was probably going to be in here at some point. But I want to take this from a different perspective instead of just being general and saying you need to plan out your steps and you need to plan out the things that you want to do before you actually do them. I think there's some things that we can actually do beforehand to actually make the planning stage a little easier, but also more targeted and more fruitful. And so what I mean by that is something that we talk about within the DAT program specifically, and when we think about quality improvement and process improvement, is the idea of a SWOT analysis. So that's SWOT, SWOT. What that is doing an analysis of your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and potential threats to whatever process you want to change or whatever change you want to implement into your clinical practice. And so by completing that SWOT analysis, what you can do is actually make the planning process a little easier because you've already brainstormed some of the strengths and opportunities that you have and that you can leverage, but also some of the weaknesses and threats that you may encounter along the way, so that you can start to also brainstorm and kind of see what opportunities you have to combat those weaknesses or strengthen those weaknesses. So understanding what resources are available to you for those weaknesses, understanding what threats might occur while you're in this actual change process, so that you can start to kind of game plan those and understand how you can try to leverage other resources for those. Specifically, when we get into setting goals, I think we, as athletic trainers, and something that we teach in the DAT is setting SMART goals. So things that are specific, measurable, attainable, reasonable, and timely. So making sure there's a time aspect that you have tied to that. But I think something that we often overlook is the reasonable aspect of this. And what is reasonable within that time frame. So a lot of times when we think about change in our clinical practice, we think about completely overhauling some sort of process or completely redesigning the way that we're currently doing something. But what that does is it basically is biting off too much that you can chew. And so when you actually start to implement this change, you quickly become overwhelmed and you quickly are more likely to abandon that change process. So understanding that setting goals is more than just saying, I want to change this or I want to change that, but actually understanding the step-by-step process of how to actually achieve that end goal. And the way that we do that is through routine and habits. And so one thing that I love to talk about is the idea of a mini habit, which is something, it's a habit that is so stupid small that it can't fail. And so what that is something that you do on a daily or maybe every other day basis, that you get into the idea that it's something so small that you can't fail at doing it. So if we think about the idea of exercise, and every January, we know a lot of people create this idea or create this New Year's resolution that they want to start hitting the gym again. They want to lose weight. And they might do that for a couple of weeks, maybe a month or two, but then by March or April, that habit has died and that kind of routine has gone away. Why is that? Well, most of the time that's because the internal resistance or the resistance to that change or to changing that process of going to the gym every day is too high, so that when the motivation is gone for going to the gym every day, that person will actually just stop going to the gym. So it's the idea of relying on motivation to cause change. We need to stop relying on motivation, and we need to actually rely on just habit building to cause change. So instead of saying that I'm going to go to the gym for an hour every day, it may be something as easy as just putting on workout shoes. Because by putting on the workout shoes, you've already decreased the resistance to not working out because you already have the shoes on. So you might as well do some sort of exercise. Or particularly in the book Mini Habits, the author talks about the idea of doing the 1 push-up challenge. So if working out is the habit that you're trying to build, starting off with just 1 push-up a day, because once you do 1 push-up, you realize how easy it is to do a 2nd push-up. And once you do a 2nd push-up, then you realize how easy it is to do a 3rd push-up. And you start to build this habit of doing 1 push-up a day, and then eventually that leads to some sort of 30-minute workout or some sort of continuous habitual working out every day. But the idea is that the habit isn't working out every day for 30 minutes. The habit is just doing a single push-up. The routine is doing a single push-up every single day so that you decrease the resistance. You're no longer relying on motivation, but you start to see the positive benefits of a continued process. So to combine these two concepts of goal setting and creating routines and habits, I wanted to give you guys this pyramid scheme of kind of goal development. And so this is something that I cannot take credit for. This is from the journal called the Best Self Journal. And so what the creators of this journal did was broke down the idea of creating habits into actions and tasks rather than just, creating goals to actions and tasks rather than just focusing on the overall goal. So we have this overall goal that we want to change. So specifically, as we've been talking about today, we want to change something within our clinical practice. So we have this overall result goal. So maybe that's, we want to implement some sort of patient-reported outcome for the lower extremity injuries that we see in our clinical practice. If we create that goal and we try to just create change and start doing that without creating any kind of progress goals or actions and tasks, we don't really have a roadmap to do that. And what this does is it gives us that roadmap. So from that one result goal, then we get this idea of progress goals that we are going to look for to understand that we are making progress toward this overall goal. So maybe that progress goal is finding a patient-reported outcome that is going to match the conditions and the patient population that you see. And then progress goal 2 is that we are implementing that with 50% of the patients with this said condition by X date. And progress goal 3 is that we maybe increase that percentage, or maybe we increase the number of conditions that we're seeing. And so then what you do from there is you break down your progress goal into actionable tasks. So things that you are going to actually be able to do on a daily or weekly basis to actually meet that progress goal. So for progress goal 1, if we said that's finding a patient-reported outcome, then maybe that's spending 5 to 10 minutes a day for 2 weeks to actually find that patient-reported outcome. So we're actually going to search through the literature and search through the evidence to find what patient-reported outcome might match our patient population and the conditions that we are seeing. And then progress goal 2, we said, is going to be to potentially implement this certain patient-reported outcome with 50% of patients by X date. So these tasks are going to be based on actually implementation. So we are going to implement this with every single patient that has this condition for a solid week, and we're going to chart the potential barriers or the challenges that we had with that. And then we're going to come up with solutions to overcome those barriers and challenges so that we can make progress toward progress goal 3. So this is a nice kind of way or roadmap to break down a result goal and actually break that down into kind of progress goals that you can see that you're taking actual steps toward that overall goal, but also to see how we can combine both habits, routines, as well as goal planning or goal setting into actionable tasks that we can take on a daily basis. So from there, we're going to go into our 4th step, and that's the actual execution. This is what I would probably consider, once we've actually become self-aware and we've empowered ourselves to know that we can create this change, And if we've actually done the planning process and we've kind of created goals that are reasonable, measurable, things that we know that we can actually implement and not become overwhelmed with, because we've actually planned out and actually thought about the weaknesses and threats, this would actually be very easy and one of the more straightforward steps in actually doing or creating that habit of change over time. However, I think there's some things that we could do to maximize our execution process, our execution step of actually creating change. And so the first one of those is actually tracking progress. And so this kind of also ties back into that pyramid scheme of goal setting. So tracking progress can look different based on what your goal is, and it's going to look different for everybody based on how they operate. But this could look like using your EMR to track certain outcomes. This could look like using an Excel document. This could look like paper and pencil if that's what's easiest for you and that's what's going to decrease the resistance. But having some sort of way to actually, on a physical paper or computer, to actually document your progress and track changes in your practice over time could actually help you see and be a visual representation of what your change looks like and what your practice might be influenced by this change process. So actually having a system to track progress is something that should be considered within that planning process, but actually doing that at consistent time points throughout the implementation of this change process. So maybe this looks like, if we're going to continue with this patient-reported outcome example, maybe this looks like documenting these patient-reported outcomes in our EMR or on an Excel document, but consistently doing that, and each week spending some time to actually document that and also look at what we've been documenting for barriers and challenges to implementation of these patient-reported outcomes. That gives us a sense of accomplishment because we can see some change in that, but also kind of hold us a little bit of self-accountability. The other thing that we can do during the execution phase is understand that failure is part of the journey. I know this isn't actually something that we would be doing, but I think this is something that is often overlooked and can also discourage us when we're trying to change or implement change in our practice. And that can then increase resistance to change later on. But understanding that failure, you know, there's a saying in education that failure is a first attempt in learning. So fail, F-A-I-L, first attempt in learning. I think it's kind of funny, but I think that when we understand that there's going to be hiccups and that there's going to be challenges that we're going to face, and we're not always going to get it right, especially on our first time, giving yourself some grace and understanding that can help you understand what weaknesses and threats there might be later on or in your next go around, but decrease that resistance to change. And this can also tie back into our self-awareness first step when we're going through this process. Understanding that failure is going to be part of it can help us realize that once we actually encounter this, that's okay. We plan for it moving forward and we continue on. We don't give up. We don't kind of throw in the towel or become resistant to change from there. And coupled with that, the other thing is understanding that success isn't always going to be reaching the mountaintop, that we need to celebrate our small successes along the way. So maybe we didn't get to 50% of implementation of that patient-reported outcome by the date that we had set previously, but maybe we got to 42%. Is that a total failure? I would suggest that it's not. It's a small step forward, and we're moving in the right direction to cause change in our practice and elevate the way that we are practicing and advance our practice. So understanding that the success doesn't always have to be that peak of the pyramid, that result goal achievement. It's not always going to be the mountaintop. I know I put the mountaintop guy here, but it's not always going to be thumbs up on the mountaintop. It might be getting to base camp 1, that level 1. Maybe you're only 10,000 feet and you wanted to get to 30. That's still a success. You're still moving forward. One thing that we talk about here in the DAT is that an inch is still momentum. It doesn't always have to be getting to the next train station. If you move an inch, you've moved an inch in the right direction. As long as you're going in the right direction, that's still momentum. So understanding that failure is going to happen and that success is also going to happen, but making sure that we celebrate and we give ourselves a pat on the back, if you will, during the small successes is really going to help us also gain momentum for future change and to continue to want to elevate and advance our practice. So the last kind of step here is a little different, and it's not necessarily something that would look like a continuous process, but something that we should be considering throughout each of the opportunities that we have to change, and that's asking for accountability. And I think that this is something that takes humility, but also takes great confidence in. It can feel awkward at first if we've never asked for accountability, but the more people that we bring in that want to see us succeed and want to see us elevate our practice, the more opportunity that we're going to have for people to say, you know, hey, how's that going with the thing that you wanted to change? Hey, how is that implementation of patient-reported outcomes going? And if we haven't been doing it, it's a great check to know, hey, maybe I need to get back on this, or, you know, it opens up an opportunity, an avenue to have a conversation to say, I've encountered these barriers and I'm not quite sure what to do about it. It gives us other opportunity to have conversation and other brains to help us potentially find avenues or other solutions to those problems. But what I said initially is that it takes great humility. What this also asks us as humans to do is not become defensive and not become, and to put our egos aside, to ask somebody and say, hey, I really want to change X, Y, or Z, and I want you to be my accountability buddy. I need some help in doing this. I want to make sure that I'm staying on top of this. So would you mind checking in with me X period of times over the next couple of months to see how this thing is going? That takes humility, and that takes, again, an increased self-awareness, but that also takes confidence to know that you have the ability to change and that you are actually going to actually implement this change. By inviting other people in, it gives us, like I said, another great check to make sure that we are actually completing the steps that we need to. And it gives us some other opportunity in the planning process, particularly to run things by other people. So if there is something that you are looking to implement in your practice or something that you want to change in your practice, research people out there or people in your network, maybe people, mentors, colleagues, coworkers, past classmates who have also done something similar or who know a little bit more about that subject matter, and ask them for accountability, because then you can also use them in the planning stage and say, hey, I know that you implement patient-reported outcomes quite regularly. What were some challenges or some barriers that you experienced at first, and how did you overcome those, so that you can include those within your planning process and start to brainstorm and start to game plan how you can overcome those before they even become a problem for you. So again, asking for accountability is going to take a little bit of humility and a little bit of vulnerability, but if you do, it's going to be potentially one of the strongest steps that you can take to implement change, as long as those accountability partners or those that you've asked to come alongside you really do have your best interest in mind and are really gonna lock arms with you and hold you accountable and also raise you up and kind of advocate for you. So with that, I think the last thing that I would like to mention is that this is a continuous process. This isn't an A to Z process. This is a cycle that is supposed to be continuous. So as you go through these 5 steps and you become more self-aware and you become empowered, you plan the change that you want to execute, you create the steps that you want to see towards that result goal, you execute them, you're using your accountability, and you go, you should have some sort of reflection period, right? As I mentioned from that self-awareness step. to understand, how did this go? Was this successful? Was this not? What were some of the potential challenges that I faced, and how can I improve this moving forward? So with that, I thank you guys for joining me today for this webinar. And I hope that this has given you guys some tangible steps that you guys can take to actually implement some sort of change in your clinical practice.